Coming at you from the frozen tundra that is East Central Alberta, Canada, streaming live on YouTube, Facebook, Float, Odyssey, Telegram, Twitch, TikTok, and the Prepper Broadcast Network. Welcome back to the workshop where we create community, find freedom, promote preparedness, and share success. I am Toolman Tim, and today is December 9th, 2022, and this is episode 217 of the Workshop Podcast. We're going to get into a good one today. It's one I've been working on for a while. It goes back to the idea of if you're stranded on a desert island, what would you take with you? In this case, it is if you're in a bunker or you need to bug in at home for a long period of time, what media, books, audio, all of that jazz, movies, would you have with you to pass the time? So I made a list, but before we dive into that, let's get the announcements out of the way. Number one, Prepper Broadcast Network. My brothers and sisters, my fellow content creators over there, if you aren't following PBN, add them to your podcatcher because there is more than one episode a day that comes out of there. A ton of content. You will find content creators that you click with. You will find teachers over there that you enjoy. Take a minute, follow them, and if you like their stuff, sign up to be a member to help support. It helps keep the lights on and the generators fueled up. Number two is the Patch of the Month Club, guys. You know, I will beat that to death, but that is my baby, and I appreciate you guys supporting me. If you're interested, check it out, patchofthemonth.co. Run by there, $10 a month, $100 a year. You get a really cool, for my sick and twisted mind, Velcro patch that you can show off with pride or hide it out of shame, whatever one you prefer. But run by there, check it out, sign up, and support the workshop, guys. And finally, today's tool is a Jiggle Siphon. And you're like, Tim, I don't know what the hell a Jiggle Siphon is. And if you don't, that's totally fine because I didn't before I bought one. But it is just a long piece of vinyl tubing with a copper, I don't even want to call it a copper valve, but it is. It's at the end, there's a copper coupling with a glass ball inside of it. And you just put that glass ball / copper coupling down inside whatever you want to get fuel or water out of. You put that obviously at the higher end, and then you shake it up and down, and it creates suction, pulls that through, pulls whatever fluid through you want to transfer. It's so simple, but it's so hard to describe in audio form. Check it out. They're like $10. They're worth having multiple ones. Get a good quality one so that it holds up in the cold weather. That's the biggest problem I've had with some in the past is the vinyl gets kinky. Yeah, imagine that. Kinky vinyl. And it won't bend, and it holds its shape way too much. But there's good ones out there. I got a link for one that I prefer in the show notes today. And so with that, guys, I'm looking forward to this. I recorded this about a week ago when I was heading away for the weekend with my wife. Had a good time. This was, I shared with you my list of the books I would take, the movies I would take, and the music that I would take. But the big thing is I want to hear your list, so share them with me, especially if you're listening over on Fountain. Send a boostergram over and say, hey, Tim, these are my choices for the media that I'd like to be stuck with for the rest of my life. So with that, let's dive in today's show, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey guys, Toolman Tim here, back with another edition of Ramblings from the Road. I am still on my way to Edmonton. What a beautiful day. I love it when I have to wear sunglasses when it's minus 23 outside currently. Absolutely gorgeous. Roads are clear, sun is shining, putting miles behind me, getting recording done, listening to some audiobooks. It's just a beautiful day, and I'm going to have a whole weekend away with my missus, Christmas shopping, and probably eating too much at our favorite restaurants, that kind of stuff. So, you guys ever hear, well, of course you have, but when we were kids, we always used to play that game. What would you do if you were alone on a desert island? Or they'd always give you those thought experiments. Well, if you were alone on a desert island, what items would you take with you? And this all came out of, I guess it was last night, we did the latest edition of the post-apocalyptic book. We talked about the TV show Alone, Alan Kay being the first winner of that. They give you a list of gear, and you're allowed to pick, I want to say something like 10 items that you can take with you. I would take 3 pounds of rice and some scenario, where you think back to Tom Hanks in Castaway. He has to deal with absolutely everything that washes up on shore. That's all he has. That's it, I mean, wasn't the most productive thing in the world. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but when he used that ice skate to take that tooth out, yeah, anyway, whatever. So he had to use what he had to use. So, and of course, everybody has played this debate through and through and through, ad nauseum, right? And it's always a fun one to have, but I thought we'd do a different spin on it. A while back, I was brainstorming, putting ideas down for shows, and you guys know that I love post-apocalyptic fiction, shit hits the fan fiction, end of the world, whatever, outbreaks, that kind of stuff. And if you guys remember back to March 13th, 2020, I don't know if anybody remembers what happened that day or not. And they started with all the lockdowns, and originally, most people were like, hey, I'll stay home for a bit, and then it got worse and worse, and well, we know where it ended up. But during that time, there were some odd things that sold out. Of course, bread making equipment, home hair care products, especially things like thinning shears and barber shears, electric trimmers, that kind of stuff. The kind of things that you had to take care of by yourself. One of the biggest things that you almost couldn't get, I remember going into Walmart and looking at the shelves, and they had just, at one time, massive amounts of board games, things that would pass the time with the family, and they sold out. There was such a demand that the company started printing more of them. Kind of like the flour situation with Robin Hood Flour up here. They ended up, they had the flour, but they didn't have the packages to put it in, so they ended up using commercial packaging for a while. So, it's one of those scenarios. But people knew they were going to have a lot of downtime. They were going to spend a lot of time with their family, something that a lot of people, in our busy, extroverted, always involved in activities, modern lifestyle, love it or hate it, there's not a lot of time for the old-timey sitting around playing board games or passing the time, right? So what I decided was, based on one of my movie lists a while back, bunker video. Remember I did a video or an episode on the top bunker films. So, The Desert Island, that's blasé, passé, whatever you want to call it. Here we are. Let's talk about being in a bunker or in quarantine or being self-segregated. If you're staying away from the world for whatever reason. So you're either home or underground, whatever it is. But, we all talk about canned goods and air filters and masks and all of that shit. But one thing some of us talk about, but it hasn't been dealt with as much, is entertainment. So I thought, me personally, I would put together lists of, top 5 or 10 books, top 5 or 10 movies, top 5 or 10 board games, and top 10 albums, music, that I would want to have to pass the time. So if the whole world went gaga and I couldn't get anything else, these were the things that I would choose to have to pass the time with the family. And I'm sure everybody out there that would make a list would come up with something a bit different. So I'd like to hear your guys' list at the end. Put it in the comments, whatever it happens to be, and let me know what your lists would be. So without further ado, let's start with my top 5 board games. And this is one of those things, if you chose to go off-grid, or you're underground, or the power grid's down, or whatever that scenario might be, you're going to have a lack of power, or you're going to be conserving and reserving power because you're going to be running off of batteries or DC power or solar. So you're not going to have a lot. Now you might have LED lights or an LED lantern, but you're not going to be running power to play video games or a lot of the modern trappings of today's world, right? So you got to go back to the olden times. And of course, so my first choice is the old standby of Monopoly. The ending of families everywhere. The game that can last forever. Well, not forever, but 2 or 3 hours. So it passes a lot of time. It's kind of a passive game, but it involves a lot of strategy. Now, Would it cause fights? Yeah, it causes fights. But you know what? Again, the very first game at the beginning of COVID that we started playing with the kids was Monopoly, because it's just that game. It's the game that everybody has to have. You know, I'm pretty sure there was a copy of Monopoly in 10 Cloverfield Lane. They were playing some sort of homemade version of Monopoly in A Quiet Place. Monopoly's just there. Everybody knows how to play it, or at least everybody has their own rules to it. And despite the fact that, yeah, it can cause fights, it's still a great game to have. So for me, my first one is always got to be the classic Monopoly. And then from there, I want a game that can pass a whole day. And I never played Axis and Allies. I know people in school and college that played it, and they could pass a couple of days with Axis and Allies. I've never played Dungeons and Dragons, which I also maybe would be a fun one to play. But so the game I picked that would pass the most time was Risk. I love Risk. My kids can play Risk with me. Alice and Charlotte have beat me at Risk before. And that's the type of game that can take 2 or 3 times as long as a standard game of Monopoly. So if you're looking for, you know, most bang for your buck with a board game that'll pass the time and allow you to sit down, and it's competitive, but it's not the same competitive nature as Monopoly, then go with Risk. And if you've never played Risk, pick it up and learn. It's just a fun game. So yeah, Risk would be the next one for sure. I love it. It was something. So I've talked about some of the worst winter storms I've ever seen. And, you know, they just had that one in Buffalo recently where, you know, they had, 4.5, 5 feet of snow. And I only ever seen, like I said, about 2 of those storms in my life. And one of them was what we called White Wand. And it was a blizzard that came in February after the September Hurricane Juan that we had. So it was like basically a blizzard and a hurricane combined. And my buddy Alex lived just the block over, and there was drifts that were up to second-story windows everywhere. It was a mess. And what did we do to pass the time? We sat down and we played Risk. How could you not? That was the game. We're like, well, we have hours. Let's hope the power stays on. For the most part in town, the power did. There was a few places that ended up shutting down. That was the time that we had to get all the ice cream out of Dairy Queen, and, you know. But for the most part, so our go-to game of passing a long time during an emergency with my buddies was Risk, and it'll work. The next one is Uno. I had a lot of fun playing that game as a kid with my cousins. My cousin Marty, they always used to have Uno and Skippo down there. And it's just fun. The cool thing about Uno is it can fill 10 minutes or it can fill 3 hours. You can sit down and play it and eat popcorn and drink pop or whatever it is and just have a lot of fun. And it's competitive, but again, it's not competitive like Monopoly. You know, it's, hey, I'm going to beat you, and if you beat me, I'm going to be pissed, but soon enough, I'm going to be able to beat you because we're going to go right back at it. And it's fun and action-packed, and one of the things about an action-packed card game is, more than a slow game like Monopoly, it'll actually help your mind forget for a little while whatever hardship you're going through. So that's what's fun about Uno. When the cards start flopping down and you hit the reverse and the skip your turn and add 3, and you get you see people are pissed off, but they're smiling at the same time. It's like, oh, yeah, that is those few seconds you get where you're thinking, you know what? Everything's normal. I don't have to worry. So that would be a fun one to have with the kids for sure. Now, the next one for me is Dominoes. Now, this was a game. There's 2. And if you asked, growing up, before my grandfather got sick and went into a home, at Christmas and holidays, all of that, we would always, all 9 brothers and sisters on my dad's side would get together. All the cousins would get together. And the official Cook family game is Dominoes. We have our own rules that are a little bit different, but it's competitive. It's loud. People pretend to cheat. They have fun with it. It's just the way in my family, there is no laughter louder than when the family is playing Dominoes. That's the way to do it. And again, it's another game. You know, one game takes about a half an hour or so. And then when that passes, if you got more time to pass, you skip over and play another one. And then the last one is Crib. And it's a bit of a cheat, but the reason I picked Crib was because it involved a deck of cards. And if you have a deck of cards, the games you can play are infinite, right? You know, we like Hearts and 45s. Those are two of our family's favorite games. But Crib was always a fun one because it combines playing cards and quote-unquote a board game, right? The Crib board. And it's fun. You know, it involves math and strategy and a bunch of different things when it comes to figuring and ciphering stuff out. So it engages that part of the brain that allows you to forget about the hard times for a minute. And it's a lot of fun. And it's also a game that is hard for younger people. So it would be a skill and something you could learn as you went along. Passed by 4 white and black spotted horses. I don't know if I've ever quite seen them like that. I was going to say they look like zebras. They didn't look like zebras, but they were very much black spots on a white horse all the way up and down. So that was board games. We got that out of the way. Next is music. I love music. Now, this was a selfish list. I put this together just for my musical tastes, not for the kids or the wife or anything like that. If I'd have done that, it would have been a whole different story. It would have been a bunch of music on there that I'd rather drove nails into my ears, and, you know, probably would have been Post Malone on there. That's somebody that both my wife and I could listen to. But this was just strictly, I picked these albums on re-listenability. How, you know, 2 things. How full are they with top quality tunes that I could listen to? And how many times have I listened to these albums over the years? And when we get to it, I'll tell you the second album on this list is the one I've listened to the most in my lifetime. But the very first album I picked, and so I had a couple rules when I made these 10 albums. First, you know, it needed to be a top quality album. So greatest hits compilations were good. It was only 1 album per artist, simply because that's just how I wanted to roll. And they had to be infinitely re-listenable. So first one was AC/DC Live, because they've never really put out a greatest hits compilation that was as good as AC/DC Live. I remember the double cassette from 1990. It was everywhere when I was in junior high. Love that album. And it has so many good tunes. You know, it was really, I would say Thunderstruck was their last absolute classic song. And it's on there. So you've got every classic AC/DC song with the crowd playing in the background, plus a bunch of odd tunes like A Whole Lot of Rosie and stuff like that. But it is just a killer album that I could listen to day in and day out. It was, you know, right in the height of Brian Johnson's, you know, when his vocals were at their peak. You know, they're long past their prime, but you can't blame the guy. He's well into his 70s now, right? And, you know, who would ever thought that he could have replaced Bon Scott? But, so, AC/DC Live. I have it on vinyl. I love it. Almost all these albums I have on vinyl. But next, and this is the one I've listened to the most, we listened to it the most that we actually wore through the cassette tape, and it was Nirvana Unplugged. We were all grunge heads, me and all my buddies in high school. We listened to Kurt Cobain, and after he passed, you know, I don't remember the day he passed because I was like 13 at the time, but after he passed, we found Nirvana Unplugged. You know, we'd already listened to Smells Like Teen Spirit, Nevermind, that album a ton, but we hadn't heard Unplugged yet, and it came out, it was like 3 or 4 months after he died, or right before he died. I can't remember exactly when, but we listened to that nonstop, and that was, you know, there's a couple other albums, a couple other live performances that Kurt and the boys did that were as good or almost as good, but there is just something, it's like lightning in a bottle, Unplugged, and I could listen to it all day long. You know, even with the strange cover songs that Kurt picked, thinking that he would kind of troll the critics and all that, it's a friggin' classic, and it's so listenable, and it's not, you know, it's not a loud album, of course, because it was unplugged. It was basically acoustic. Next is Green Day Dookie, and this is one of the few non-compilation albums on here, but it was probably the album that kind of made me fall in love with, you know, pop punk. It was the first kind of adult, you call it adult, you know, teen angst music that I listened to. It was one of the first albums, one of the first cassettes that I bought from Columbia House, and I loved it. And I have listened to that, and I can listen and sing along with every album, with every track on that album. Love it. There's just not a bad tune on there, and it's one of the few albums that I can listen to start to finish
that isn't a compilation album. Just awesome. The next one, and this is another one by Smashing Pumpkins. This is Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness. And honestly, I mean, Billy Corgan, I can listen to anything that he puts out. They don't have a greatest hits out on vinyl yet. And the worst with Smashing Pumpkins is they have a good song or two good songs on just about every album they put out. But this album was the best one, or the combined album or whatever. But when it comes down to it, it has, probably my all-time favorite song, 1979 by the Smashing Pumpkins, is on there. So it's a good one. I enjoyed it. I love that album. And like I said, I can listen to Billy Corgan sing all day long. Lynyrd Skynyrd, their album, it's pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd or self-titled, whatever you want to call it, is just so good. I could listen to Tuesday's Gone all day long, and there's not a bad track start to finish on there. There's some exceptional tracks and then some good tracks, but that whole album is just friggin' classic. From there, next one is another compilation album. When I was a kid in high school, my dad introduced me to a lot of 70s music, so obviously Lynyrd Skynyrd. A little bit Leonard. He wasn't much into them, but BTO was one he loved, Bach and Turner Overdrive. But his all-time favorite band, if you ask him to this day, is Creedence Clearwater Revival. And he introduced me to and they have so many tunes. And almost everybody loves them. But CCR Chronicles, that album, I think it has 20 tracks on it. It's absolute perfection. Love it. Could listen to it. Have listened to it so many times. Great to listen to in the background. The next one, some of you are going to say, what in the hell? But if Amy Dingman's listening, she'll appreciate this one. And it's the best of Nickelback. It's their greatest hits album. I'm a Canadian. I grew up listening to Nickelback in high school. But I listened to them before their big breakout hit. I listened to them back when they were an indie band getting played on Much Music, Canadian version of MTV. Thinking their song Leader of Men was incredible. And I loved it. And that was, I want to say, 2 or 3 years before How You Remind Me comes out. So I've always loved them. You can hate on them if you want. They've almost become a meme of themselves. It's great. Then I picked 2 country albums because in the 90s, I listened to rap, I listened to grunge, I listened to punk, and I listened to new country. So the first one was Alan Jackson's Greatest Hits. Could listen to Alan Jackson all day long. Just every song he put out I loved. So good. He has that, butter will melt in his mouth kind of song, and they're all infinitely sing-alongable. And then the other one, and this may surprise some of you, I don't know, but Black Hawk's Greatest Hits. They were my all-time favorite. They are my all-time favorite country band. Love them. Could listen to them all the time. My all-time favorite country song, I would say, is Goodbye Says It All by Black Hawk, for sure. And then, that would be it right there. That's number one. There's a few that come after it, a couple tunes by Lone Star and that sort of thing. But Black Hawk's Greatest Hits, that album came out after they only had like 3 albums out. So it's full of all the 90s tracks that I loved. And then the final one is a soundtrack to a movie. I thought I wanted to put one soundtrack on there. I thought about Pulp Fiction, but it's not quite as re-listenable for sure, and it's kind of, you have to be in the mood for Pulp Fiction. But I picked Dazed and Confused, the original soundtrack. Love that film, but more than that film, that soundtrack is just dynamite. So many top 70s hits on there. You can put either side of either album on the turntable, and you're going to have a good time. So there's that. Now, films. And this is one of those things, what do you do? Do you put the films on USB? Do you buy a DVD player that runs on batteries? Do you do both? 2 is 1, 1 is none? I don't know. For me, honestly, it'll probably be a USB filled with movies. But I picked a mix between action and comedy. And again, I would have to let Becky make her list of 10 because these are not 10 that she would watch all the time, but I picked the ones that are the most entertaining, the most quotable, and the most rewatchable. So again, like music, right? But the first one, I guess you could call it an action film, but it's probably the only one that doesn't fall directly in action or comedy, and that is Pulp Fiction. The single movie, other than a Christmas one we're going to talk about down here in a minute. It's a single movie that I have watched the most in my lifetime. It is the movie that introduced me to the love of what I called B movies or indie films in high school, and action, ultra violent, that kind of stuff. So I lived for Pulp Fiction back in the day, guys, and I've watched it so many times. Then The Matrix, that came out when I was 18 years old. Lived for that movie. I just pretend like it's the only one that came out. There's no 3 sequels afterwards. I could watch that over and over again. It still looks great even to this day. I could sit down and watch it probably once a week and be entertained. Now, I had to pick a Christmas movie. Actually, I picked 2 Christmas films. They're both comedies. I love them to no end. They make me laugh. I can quote them. I've enjoyed them for so long. And that comes down to Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, which is infinitely quotable. My family, it's a running joke that they hate the movie, even though they don't. I make them watch it every year at Christmas. We're going to have a watch party with a workshop this year. But I just love it. That movie takes me back to that movie came out in 1989. I was 8 years old. Too young to even watch it at that time. But I got introduced to it on ASN, the Atlantic Satellite Network. It was a cable TV channel out of Halifax, kind of a lesser known one. They used to replay movies every single night. And at Christmas time, they would play that 4 or 5 times. And of course, it was the TV edit. So they would, all the cuss words would be bleeped out. And I just loved it. Fell in love with it. Me and my buddy Michael Outhouse in high school, we used to quote it back and forth to each other. Yeah, so there it was. Next is Home Alone. It's probably the most kiddie-ish of all the movies on here, but I have a soft spot in my heart for the original Home Alone. I could watch that with those 2 criminals getting the snot kicked out of them over and over and over again. It's a heartwarming movie. Nostalgia is great, and I think if you were, either locked in a basement or, self-quarantined at home for months on end, you're going to want some nostalgia to remind you of the good times without getting yourself too down. And I just laugh. I love it. I could watch it. Becky busts my balls over it, but it's a good one. Tremors, probably the movie that I've seen for the first time most recently. I believe I watched Tremors for the first time about 6 years ago. We were living in Alberta, maybe 7. And I'm like, when I first saw that, I thought, how have I missed you my entire life? It is, I don't know. It's right up there with Shaun of the Dead for the best horror comedy of all time. I love it. The buddy interaction between Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward, just awesome. It's fun. It's an hour and a half, 2 hour sit down and forget about absolutely everything. Then I had to pick one that's a little on the nose. If you're in an underground bunker, why not watch a movie about growing up in an underground bunker? Blast from the Past. It's the goofiest of the movies on my list. It makes me laugh. It makes me think. It's kind of sad and sappy, despite the fact that it's Brendan Fraser and Alicia Silverstone. Nobody's going to win an Oscar for their performances in that movie, but it's fun. I enjoyed it. I love it. I've watched it so many times. It has good memories attached to it because I watched it that summer that I worked at Bar None Christian Camp for kids whose parents were in prison, and we had weekends to kill, and I went to the local convenience store, rented that on VHS, and just loved it. Fell in love with it, and have watched it, I bet you 40 or 50 times since. And finally is just a balls to the wall, blood and guts action film, and that is my I don't know. I'm going to say it. It's my all-time favorite Arnold movie, and that's Commando. That movie created the genre of one man takes on an army. That movie made me fall in love with Arnold. I loved his movies. I remember my cousin coming over. It was on TV on a Sunday afternoon after church, and we asked him, hey, are you allowed to watch this? And he's like, oh yeah, sure. And then we got in shit for letting him watch it. So there's that. And I skipped one by mistake. I guess you could say there's 3 Christmas movies on this list if you want to be an asshole, but it's Die Hard. Becky and I could watch all 3 of the first 3 Die Hards over and over again. But the first is a classic. I remember sitting up when I was a kid. Mom and Dad had rented it, and I sat in the hallway and watched about 10 or 15 minutes of it. And I thought, oh my God, this is incredible. And I've watched it so many times since. And it, again, rewatchability. You can watch John McClane take on all those, European bad guys, walk through glass barefoot, do everything but die. How many times you can watch that, right? So good. And then books. This was probably my shortest. I know some people would have different opinions, but I decided to kind of cheap out, and I went with all Stephen King novels because of all the books I've read over the years, his are the ones I've read the most and reread. So I picked The Stand because, hey, if you're under quarantine, why not talk about, the bug in The Stand, the flu or Captain Trips or whatever you want to call it that was in there. Great film, or great book, sorry. I've read it 3 or 4 times. And again, I think that's his magnum opus. It's well over 1,000 pages. This would be the unbridged, unedited, uncut version. So I could pass, it's like 40 or 50 hours of Audible time with it. So, if you're sitting down to read it, it's going to take at least that. The Stand, for sure. Then, I took a different approach to books. I have never read the Dark Tower series. I think I've read the first 2 books and I've never finished the rest of them. I've read all of Stephen King's individual novels, but I haven't read his Dark Tower series, which is like 8 or 10 books, I can't remember. So I said I would take the entire Dark Tower series. I know that's a cheat. You're like, Tim, you've already ruined your list, but I've only got, okay. So I picked The Stand, I picked the Dark Tower series, and I picked the 4 or 5 compilations of short stories that Stephen King put out that I haven't read yet. I've got about half of those done. So those are those are on my list of must read, want to read. And so that's what I put on my list. I'm sure some people are like, well, what about the Bible? Well, whatever. That's great. If you want to have one, good. No problem. What about this? What about, it doesn't, you can have survival books. This was just for pure entertainment. This was for the ability to make a shitty time marginally less shitty. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. This was fun to put together. I'd like to hear your guys' list. You can send me top 5 of whatever. Top 5 music, top 5 books, top 5 movies. Send them to me. It does not. TheRealTimCook@gmail.com, or you can, Boostagram it to me. You can go on MeWe or Float or YouTube. What else? Instagram, Facebook, any of that shit, guys. Send it to me. Let me know. And I'd love to hear from you because maybe I'll do a follow-up. Maybe you guys send me your list and I'll pick the best of list and we'll deal with it that way. So anyway, that's it for me this week, guys. As always, stay happy, stay healthy, and have a great week.